All right, what I want to do today is briefly look at the presidents in the second half of the 1800s, just a little bit about their presidencies, some more than others. And then I would like to look at some pieces of land that we acquire in this time frame. So we'll look at everything up to about 1900. The next lesson is the Spanish-American War, which we'll pick up with that next Friday, once we wipe the tears off after I pass the tests out and you see your grades, and I'll give you a chance to recover, and then we'll plow into it. I meant from the joy. You'll have to come back down to reality and take notes again. So, yeah. All right, so the presidents here of the second half of the 1800s. The first one is Grant, Ulysses S. Grant. He comes in 1869, serves through 77. Where have we previously seen Grant? Civil War. Same general from the Civil War. All right. A couple of things about him. Not a whole lot of deep things about politics, but just a couple of general things. One thing is he tried to reunite the country following the Civil War. He's wanting to, ease emotional tensions. This is still in the middle of Reconstruction. That doesn't end until the next president. Wanted to calm things down. His inaugural address, he used this phrase, "Let us have peace. The war's over. Let's get things back together." So he intentionally tried to settle things down. There are others who didn't cooperate with him, but he pushed that way. Pushed for that, just reuniting the country, settling things down from the Civil War. All right, second thing for him is that he was himself a very moral and honest man. But he ended up having in his cabinet some people who really took advantage of him and did some very crooked things. There's a whole wave of scandals that come out here after he's in office. And really, as far as I can tell, he himself was not responsible or was not involved. I mean, he did appoint some of these people and that type of thing, but he was not immoral himself. Let me give a couple examples of the types of things that took place. The first one to give you, it takes place just as he's coming into office, the fall of that year. There was two businessmen who were trying to orchestrate the price of gold going up. So what they did is they bought a whole bunch of gold, and then they got the U.S. government to temporarily stop issuing gold to people. You could have a piece of paper money that you could turn into gold, but to temporarily stop that, what they wanted to do was buy a bunch of gold, have the supply chopped significantly, and if you know economics, what's that going to do to the price? When the supply of something is chopped significantly, it's going to cause the price to go up. And so their plan was buy a bunch of gold at the low price, get the government to chop the supply, let the price go up, and then sell at that high price. There's nothing immoral about buying gold cheap and selling it high. The problem is when you get the government to manipulate the price of gold. Okay, that's not too good. That happened. That actually resulted in a stock market crash in September of 1869. The two names you might recognize, Jay Gould, G-O-U-L-D, and Jim Fisk, were the two businessmen that orchestrated this. Gould, G-O-U-L-D, and Fisk, Jay and Jim. Okay, another scandal involved the railroads. We've already talked about the transcontinental railroads and the corruption and the fraud and the shoddiness. There was a wave of that continued activity here. When was the... what was the year for the... I should remember it, shouldn't I? It was 1869 that we see that first railroad connect. I was thinking it was 69. So he comes in office as that first one's done. But following that, there was a whole wave of these railroad companies bribing men in Congress to tinker with what the law said so that they can make even more money building these shoddy railroads and that time. So there's a whole scandal there. The lesson we should learn from all of this is that anytime the government begins to meddle in the economy, it creates a mess. All right. People talk about, oh, it's all the money in government, and if we got rid of the money in politics. I don't blame the auto manufacturers and the oil companies and all these people for going to Washington and exerting as much influence as they can, because Congress regulates them. Right? Congress can shut them down. Right? If we got Congress out of all of this stuff, then there'd be no reason for all the auto manufacturers to go to D.C. and influence congressmen. All right, so the problem is the government getting involved, and here's another example of it. So, and then if you want one more, there was a massive voter fraud in New York. I know that's unusual to think of. In this one, it's estimated about 18,000, give or take, people who voted with fake naturalization papers. That supposedly had been naturalized citizens and had paperwork to document it, but had fake papers. So, all right. So there's a wave of that type of activity under him. So sometimes his presidency gets clouded with this scandal issue, but really he himself was not involved. He wasn't orchestrating and trying to have voter fraud in New York. He wasn't involved. There were people that he appointed involved, but not him directly. So, all right, Grant. Let's go on to the next guy.
What was the date that Grant was president?
He was there 69 to 77, a Republican. Should probably give you that. All right, the next guy is Hayes. He's in from 77 to 81, another Republican. Hopefully, the year 77 or maybe 76 screams something to you. Hayes. Hayes. That's not what it screams to me, but we didn't do the right spelling. What happens in 1876? What's on our timeline? You've got till Tuesday to learn it, so there's no pressure. Caleb is looking, at least. Everyone else is sitting, hoping I pick Stephanie. Go ahead, Stephanie. End of Reconstruction. I might have mentioned at that point that it had to do with the presidential election. It was this election. Hayes comes in 77. The election was in 76 that took place. So, all right, the first point about him, and we'll mention a couple of things. The first main point is the election was very, very close and disputed about who won. It's funny, if you know much about history, to hear current commentators talking about this unprecedented election, and never in the history of the world have we had an election this close before. But I mean, we've had some ugly messes throughout the years, and this is another one. So, all right, the disputed election. What happens? How should we say? It looked like a guy named Tilden had actually won the day of the election. When all the counting's done in Congress, it looked like this guy Tilden had won. But there were 4 states where the results were in question. All right, and if all 4 of those states went against Tilden, then Hayes would win. So the initial thought was Tilden won. It even gets put in the papers that Tilden wins. But very quickly thereafter, a couple of these states, there's some disputes about how the election actually went and which president won in those states. So we get thrown back into this quandary of, without those 4 states, Tilden doesn't have enough electoral votes to win, and Hayes doesn't have enough electoral votes. It goes down to how these states fall. And it goes on and on and on. Eventually, there had to be a committee set up in Congress to look at this thing, 5 from the Democrats, 5 from the Republicans, and 5 members of the Supreme Court sit down and look at this thing and fight over it. And anyway, the end result is all 4 of the disputed states went to Hayes, and he became president. Okay. Caleb's thinking, that seems odd, right? But on the other side, the Democrats are willing to live with that to end Reconstruction. On the back side, they said, all right, we'll live with that, but these troops got to leave the South. So we really don't know who won the election, right? We really don't know who won those states, but that was the ultimate decision of Congress, that Hayes won the election, having won in all 4 of those disputed states. I mentioned there were 5 senators, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 5 U.S. senators. The actual split by Republican Democrat was 8-7 with the members of the Supreme Court in there. So you might think, well, a little bit of politics. Yes, there's a little bit of politics, even back here. So, okay, so the very disputed election, and you can imagine if we had wall-to-wall coverage of news like we have today, the nonstop cycle of all of the people on the committee would be analyzing them and going through their back history, and CNN would have all the Republicans being wicked and corrupt and probably should put them in jail, and Fox News would join them, I think. They might go after all the it would just be this big bloodbath. So anyway, disputed election. In the end, Hayes is picked as the winner by this committee, sending these 4 states to him. So, all right, so a disputed election. The second thing I have for him is his dealings with the South. Just 2 things to mention. One, he did pull the troops out of the South. That was part of this agreement to settle the election. The Democrats were willing to live with him as long as the troops left the South. And then the second thing is he appointed a Southerner to his cabinet. So just the symbolicness of that. Here we have a Republican, a Northern candidate effectively, bringing a Southerner onto his cabinet. So trying to soften the blow there a little bit. Okay, 2 other things with him beyond the election and all of that. He also pushed civil service reform. This civil service was a gigantic, it was a big deal. Right? And just to help you appreciate it, imagine Abraham is running for governor of Indiana. If he wins, he gets to clear out everybody that works for the state and put his own people in. Right? Think of the influence that he can have there, and the favors. You could go to Abraham and say, hey, I'm willing to go all in on the election. I'll be there, 80 hours a week, but I want this job. All right, so you can imagine the political maneuverings go back and forth as all of these jobs are up for grabs, and the people that help him the most, he awards with the better jobs and that type of thing. Anyway, Hayes here took some steps to try to remove some of that ugly politics out of it. The main thing he did was he passed a law, or instructions as the boss, that if you worked for the government, you could not be the manager or the operator of any political organization. Right? So if you were the Assistant Secretary of State, you couldn't also be the head of the Republican Party in your state. Right? Trying to a little bit separate the two. So anyway, so some civil service reform. We know that builds some steam, and we jettison that completely. So that. All right, and then the last thing for him is he very consciously tried to set a good moral example for the American people. He wanted to be the example, even to things like not having alcoholic beverages in the White House. That would be fun. His wife was called Lemonade Lucy because of that. So anyway, intentionally a very good moral example. Oh, wow. Would we then claim that Bill Clinton intentionally tried to be an immoral example? That guy was a filthy pig. It's just, All right, you'll read about it, all right, and hopefully you get sick. All right, next president is Garfield. He is president for part of 1881. Doesn't go so well for him. All right, the first main point is that he gets shot and killed. He gets shot on July the 2nd. He becomes president in the spring. Gets shot on July the 2nd. Dies on September the 19th. All right, the civil service system, there was already pressure to reform that. This drives it over the edge. He was shot by a guy who thought he should have been given a job. The particular job was he wanted to work in the U.S. embassy office in Paris. He had helped the president win, and he thought he should get this position, and he wasn't given that position. So the obvious solution is you kill the president. I mean, you apply for a job and they don't hire you, you go and kill the guy. And anyway, so he was not given that job, and in his deranged mind, the correct thing was to shoot the president. So he does. It was this assassination that pushed the country over the edge to change the civil service, or change the spoil system and go to the civil service system. The law that changes that comes in 1883, 2 years later. So that this has pushed them over the edge to change that thing. So, all right, so Garfield gets assassinated, doesn't serve a very long term.
Who assassinated?
Charles, Guiteau. And I always think that Caleb might be able to pronounce this one for us. Guiteau? Guiteau? I always say Guiteau, but what? Guiteau. Sounds good. I just have you see all these words and I'll record them, and this is what it is. Or better yet, I'll just make my laptop. You can go to, there's websites that pronounce these words for you. So go there. The other day we were talking about medicine. Okay. If they had left him laying where he got shot to crawl and survive on his own, he probably would have lived. But they haul him off to a house, and all the doctors are trying to find the bullet that was still in him, and they're sticking their, not with sterile gloves on, sticking their fingers in, trying to dig the bullet out, and it gets an infection. And that's what kills him finally in September. So there's if you get to travel in time and you end up in the 1880s and you chop your leg off or something, just sew it up yourself. Okay, don't go to the doctor. Not that they were not negligent; they just didn't even know anything about germs or anything. It comes along here very shortly after this, but he was a victim. So, all right, Garfield. Let me read for you a little bit of some comments about Garfield. It'd been fun to have a president like this. Prior to being president, well, let me just read it to you. It was reported that while James Garfield was serving as president of Hiram College in Ohio, a father interested in enrolling his son in the college approached Garfield about allowing the young man to take a shorter course than the regular one. The father explained that the boy wanted to go to college, but thought he would never be able to learn everything in the curriculum. When the father asked if Garfield could arrange for the boy to take a shorter course of study, Garfield replied, "Oh yes, I can arrange for it. Your son can take the shorter course. It all depends on what you want to make of him. When God wants to make an oak, he takes 100 years, but when he wants to make a squash, he requires only 2 months." So, all right, next one. This is Garfield defending the Bible. While the young James Garfield, let's see, this is from The Life and Speeches and Public Services of James Garfield. All right. While the young James Garfield was serving as a teacher and lay minister, he was called upon by the people of Chagrin Falls, Ohio, outside Cleveland, I think that is. I have an aunt that lives in that area. To defend, my wife has an aunt, so I'd have an aunt-in-law. Would that be the right phrase? To defend the Bible against the vicious attacks of an infidel. An influential professor gave a series of lectures in that community as well as elsewhere, purporting to prove by scientific evidence that the Bible could not be true. Many people were swayed by his cunning arguments. The Bible believers were at a loss to refute his logic. When the professor boastfully challenged anyone in Ohio to refute his arguments, Bible-believing citizens called upon Garfield to defend the Scriptures. Just think about a president. That would be refreshing. Now, if the Quran was challenged, then our current president might be able to try to defend that, but not the Scriptures. All right. Too wise to face the wily professor unprepared, Garfield secured ahead of time a summary of the lecture he knew the infidel would deliver. He also secured copies of the latest scientific books, including ones he knew his opponent intended to use in an attempt to refute the Bible. When the day for the debate arrived, James Garfield was well prepared. And then this part is a quote from a biography about him. The professor, amid the smiles of his followers and with perfect confidence in his ability, opened the debate with his statements of scientific facts and their bearing on the account of creation and the miracles in the Bible. The professor did not try to be precise and accurate in all his statements, for he was sure that Mr. Garfield would not attack him on scientific ground. And when he stated any difficult questions, he explained very kindly in simple language for Mr. Garfield's better understanding. He repeated, however, almost verbatim, the lecture of which Mr. Garfield had a copy. If you've ever been in a debate, it puts Garfield in a good position here. Garfield said nothing until his turn came. And when he arose, it was apparent to all that the professor had predisposed the audience in favor of infidelity. When, however, Mr. Garfield coolly and with a readiness and knowledge that really astonished his hearers, took up the professor's arguments one by one, and quoting from books and histories, using the professor's own authorities against him, and piling up unanswerable names above them, there was a sudden overtuning as an earthquake might make. It seemed miraculous to the people, who very reasonably supposed that Mr. Garfield had not heard the professor's arguments before. The professor had the closing speech to make, but he saw that he had lost the battle, and his forces were too thoroughly routed to be rallied again. So while he claimed that with further research he could yet establish his theories, he manfully admitted that he was surprised and defeated for the time. So, anyway, Garfield. Can you imagine having a president that would be willing to do that? But the people would come and think of, we need somebody that can defend the Bible. Obama does not come to mind. Okay, nowhere in my thinking. So, all right, that was Garfield. Serves a very short term. All right, next president, Chester A. Arthur. Another Republican. He's president from 81 to 85. He is the guy that takes over when Garfield is shot. Okay. If you need to put that, he becomes president on September the 19th, 1881, the day Garfield dies. Before that point, he would have been acting as president, but when he died, he officially became the president. Just two things beyond that to mention for Garfield. One, he signed the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act. What did I say? Arthur. Sorry. One other thing. Garfield's gone, so down to Arthur. One other thing for Arthur. He's the one that signed the Pendleton Act. Who remembers that? Okay, you remember hearing it. Okay, well, that's a step in the right direction. Who remembers hearing it and remembers what it was about? I've kind of already alluded to it, but not by name. It's passed in 1883, 2 years after he's assassinated by a crazy guy that thought he should have been given a job. Yes, he got rid of the spoils system and set up the civil service system, we called it, where people are hired based upon their ability without the politics. So we talked about before about how it's a two-edged sword at best. It does take the politics out of it. It also gives us this bureaucracy that is cemented in place that the president can't remove. So anyway, he's the president that actually signed that thing. All right, and then the other thing to mention for him is that during his presidency, the American government, this is crazy to think of, began bringing in more money than it needed. Wow. I mean, they paid all the expenses, paid all the interest on the debt, paid all, everything. Everything's paid for, had more money. So their solution, that's crazy to think about. All right, we don't have that anywhere near that today. But the second thing, their solution was to cut taxes. We're bringing in too much money. So obviously we need to cut back on taxes. Today, even Republicans, unfortunately, would see that extra money and think of some way to spend it. We could do this for people or that for people, and cut taxes. $70 million was the amount that they cut back, how much they were bringing in. So, that'd be fun. It'd be fun just to have the government bringing in more than it spent. I don't care. They could burn it for all I care, but just getting to that point would be a monumental step. So, all right, Arthur, 81 to 85. Next president is Cleveland, 85 to 89. All right, he's a Democrat. All right, he wins the election of 84, a very close election. But he manages to pull it out. So beyond that, a couple things that he's the first to do. He's the first Democrat after the Civil War. which is significant. And he's also the first president to get married in the White House. So he's born in 37, gets married in 86. So what is that, 49? Am I doing the math right? And the lucky bride was 21. Sound good, girls? So, and there's the two-edged sword. You got to put up with the old grouchy guy for a while, then you're free. When you get his retirement and all his money, you're still relatively young. Is it worth it? No, it's not worth it. Okay. All right. Anyway, first to get married in the White House as an older, middle-aged man, I guess. So, all right. A couple other things for him. He continued the civil service reform. We saw the law being passed in 83. He continues that. The particular thing that he did was he doubled the number of offices that it applied to. It was originally, I forget, about 5% or so of all the jobs. He expands it to 10%, doubles the number of positions. That has been a very usual practice as presidents are leaving office. They'll sweep more and more positions into the civil service program. Because then the people that they put into the jobs get to keep them, right? If they don't put them under the civil service program, then the next president gets to replace them. So that's a usual practice, but he does expand the civil service. He also did a lot of work making sure the veterans of the Civil War were taken care of. He wanted to make sure the veterans were taken care of, and he wanted to make sure that the frauds were weeded out. So, there were all kinds of supposedly Civil War veterans, or a lot of them were veterans, claiming that they'd been injured in the Civil War that ended up not. One well-known one is the guy that got shot hunting after the Civil War, and then is now applying for his benefits as being wounded in the Civil War. So anyway, he wanted to make sure the veterans actually got their benefits and things, but he's very careful to try to weed out the frauds. Congress at one point passed 400 bills individually giving pensions to soldiers. They would say, all right, we're going to give you this much money and you this much money. 400 individual bills. And they did it on a Friday, trying to not give Cleveland enough time to really handle it all. So Cleveland's response was to veto all 400 of them. They were wanting him just to sign them. Why mess with this? Just sign them. So he vetoed all 400 of them because they weren't giving him time to actually look at them and decide if they were fair. So anyway, he wanted to make sure the veterans were taken care of, but he did a lot of work to weed the frauds out. All right. So enough said about Cleveland. If you might want to put a note there, I probably should have said this is his first term. He serves 2 terms, but there's somebody that serves a term in between his 2 terms. This is the only time this has ever happened. So he's in from 85 to 89 and comes back in 93. So, all right, the president that serves in between is Benjamin Harrison. He's a Republican. He's there from 89 to 93.
From when?
89 to 93. Okay, not a whole lot about him to make note of here, just a couple of things. One, he obviously wins the election, so Cleveland leaves. And, it's easy to go back and cherry pick quotes, but it does seem like here that he was planning on trying to win again and come back. And Mrs. Cleveland, as she was leaving the White House, told all the servers, said, I want you to take good care of all the furniture and the ornaments in the house, for I want to find everything just as it is now when we come back in 4 years. They were planning on coming back and challenging, trying to get back in. And they actually did. So, all right, beyond that, Harrison is not an especially active president, and I don't say that as a criticism. He felt that the job of proposing and passing legislation was Congress's job. And once they were done with it, it was his job then to decide to sign it or veto it. He really didn't feel like he should take a very active role in the legislative process. So he's not actively proposing legislation or pushing it. He kind of sat back and let the gristmill of Congress produce legislation, and then he decided upon it. So It'd be fun to have the president do that as well. So, all right, so that was Harrison. So there's not a whole lot of, he's not pushing a lot of things. There are some things that happened during his term, but we can leave it at that. Question?
Was the last Indian uprising during his term or Cleveland?
That'd be 1890? It'd have been here. Yep. All right, Grover Cleveland again, next. So we have Cleveland, 85 to 89, then Harrison, 89 to 93, and then Cleveland again, 93 to 97. Okay, and here we have Cleveland winning very easily. We have Cleveland winning, and we also have Congress being controlled by Democrats, both parts of Congress being controlled by Democrats. That's the first for that since the Civil War, that we have Congress under the control of Democrats. Unfortunately, it's not a rare circumstance today.
Can you say that again?
Both sides of Congress were won by the Democrats in this election. So we have a Democrat president and a Democrat-controlled Congress. So. Excuse me. Okay, a couple of things about him. There was a big stock market crash in 1893, the year he comes into office. Big crash, and then a depression that follows that. And then the other thing I want to mention here was there was a big march on Washington by a group of about 500 men who were out of work. We have this depression and unemployment and things as a result. In 1894, there was a group of 500 men that marched on Washington, demanding that Washington do something to help them get work. The guy who led it was Jacob Coxey, C-O-X-E-Y. He's referred to as General Jacob Coxey. Not really a general, but a name as the leader of these 500 men. And this thing, they're there marching, demanding the government do something to provide them work. And Cleveland dissipates the whole thing by doing nothing until Coxey walks onto the White House grounds, and then he has him arrested for trespassing. And then once he's gone, the rest of the crowd, without any real difficulty, disperses. So it doesn't end up in a big nasty situation like it could have. So Coxey's army, Jacob Coxey. Maybe it's the Jacob name that, a little bit unhinged. I don't know. He's not going to argue with us. All right, last president here for this stretch. William McKinley, 1897 to 1901. All right, McKinley wins the election here handily, wasn't especially close. But it was a very odd election. McKinley's wife was an invalid, so she could not travel. So he stayed at home. And his campaign would bring people to his house, and he'd give speeches from his front porch to these people. So it's called the Front Porch Campaign, of him not actively traveling. I'm sure he did travel some, but not traveling all over the country like we see candidates today. The Front Porch Campaign. The other side, the Democratic nominee, was completely the opposite. He is the famous orator, Williams Jennings Bryan. We talked about him with the gold medal backing of our currency and other places. He was a famous orator. And he's the Democrat candidate. So he does just the opposite. He travels all over the country, giving speeches all over the place. So just completely drastic approaches. McKinley wins it. Bryan, at the Democratic convention that year, referenced the currency issue with gold and silver. He says, you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. He was for the bimetal currency. Then you can see his, I don't agree with his position, but a good speech anyway. And then another statement, this was, I forget when this, I don't have when this speech was, but he said, burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. but destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. Okay. A little socialist propaganda there. So, the Populist Party that we talked about, he does a lot to bring it into the Democratic Party, and we see the Populist Party really disappearing because the Democrats adopted all their positions. So, but anyway, we have Bryan's there with a completely opposite campaign, speaking everywhere, giving all these great speeches, and he loses. So, all right, McKinley wins. All right, a couple of things about him. The first one is 1900. Congress passed the Gold Standard Act. So this is kind of the answer here to this currency issue. Currency backed by gold. The Gold Standard Act. And then the other thing to mention for him is that he gets assassinated shortly after the next election. He wins the election in 1900, and then gets assassinated shortly after that. And who's the guy that comes in then? Theodore Roosevelt, which we will talk about the Progressive Era. He's the first in the Progressive Era. We'll talk about that there. So, another president assassinated. Okay, so quick rundown through there of the presidents and some things that happened in the late 1800s. Questions on any of that? All right, last thing before the test is to mention some new pieces of territory that the U.S. acquires here in this time frame. The first one is 1867. We buy Alaska. A gigantic piece of frozen tundra. At least that's the way it was described. Seward's icebox, Seward's folly. People thought it was just this empty, barren wilderness. So, if it was offered to me for what we paid for it back then, I would scrounge up the money somehow. $7.2 million for the entire state. I'll take it. Anyway, it was bought by him. Secretary of State William Seward was the guy who negotiated the deal. And it goes through. It's mocked as Seward's folly and Seward's icebox for that reason. So we buy in 1867. If you want another date, it's not until 1959 that it becomes a state. There were international things going on. Russia wanting to come and colonize in there and other things, and we were wanting to kind of put a blockade in the way of influence coming from that direction. So, but anyway, we buy it 1867. Not a bad deal. I was just talking to Bethany McGovern about the state makes so much money taxing the oil that's pumped out of the ground there that all the citizens get a check every year for whatever's left over after the government pays all of its bills. It gives back to you just because you managed to keep living for the entire year in Alaska. So I need to somehow arrange to have that be my residency up there, and I'm just visiting here. I don't know. We can figure that out. So, all right. So, Secretary of State Seward there buys Alaska. That's the first piece of territory. All right. The next piece is the Samoan Islands, out in the Pacific Ocean, about 5,000 miles south and west from California. So, way out there. All right. Before this incident here in 1899, the Samoan Islands were collectively used by several nations. They were a coaling station, a place for ships traveling across the ocean to stop and refuel on coal to run their engines and everything. So it was used by several countries. The three main ones are England, Germany, and America. We were the three main countries that were using this, and it was just, kind of a joint ownership. One of those countries starts to get greedy. If you went to public school, you might assume it was America because we were always the bad guys, but it wasn't. Germany starts to get a little greedy, and they want all of it. So Germany starts taking steps to get exclusive control over it. All three countries send warships to the area, and tensions are building. And before any real hostilities can break out, a hurricane sweeps through the area. And obviously it disrupts everything. And before everybody can get everything straight on their ships and get reorganized, this thing is settled without war. It's settled in 1899. And what happens is Germany and America split the islands. We now have American Samoa, split between the two. And is England really just the poor stepchild that didn't negotiate very well? So, they were given some land in Africa and some other islands. So they were given some other pieces of land. But the Samoan Islands get split between us and Germany. All right, so now we have a piece of territory that's ours exclusively out there in the Pacific. All right, and then the last piece to talk about is Hawaii. All right, Hawaii becomes a U.S. territory in 1900. Prior to that, there had been a lot of U.S. activity there. Going back into the early 1800s, missionaries go there, businessmen go there and build plantations, are involved in trade. And for a long time, it's a very beneficial agreement. The government of Hawaii wants us there. We want to be there. You know, things are going great. In 1891, there was a movement by the Queen, Queen Liliuokalani. The Queen is fine. To push out the Americans. She was Hawaii for the Hawaiians. And that was 1891 that she starts agitating. And it goes bad for her because the people decide to go the other direction. You know, it's not, these Americans aren't too bad here. We enjoy having jobs and the trade and all the stuff that comes with it. So instead of driving the Hawaiians out, Hawaii goes the other way and goes from being this independent country that has ties with us to wanting to be a U.S. territory. So it's 1900 that happens. Do you have a question? Oh, okay, thought you raised your hand. So 1900, we get Hawaii, another piece of land. We're not going to talk about today, but the next main event is the Spanish-American War. And in that war, we get several more pieces of territory to look at. But we will look at that with the war. All right, questions? See you Tuesday.